Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be. My name is Robert Besseling. I'm the Executive Director of EXX Africa, and I'd like to welcome you to this inaugural quarterly webinar hosted by EXX Africa. And each quarter we will try to focus on a relevant and current theme around which we have focused our most recent analysis. For those of you who are not familiar with EXX Africa, we are a specialist intelligence firm focused on providing analysis and forecasts on political risk, security risk, and economic risk, covering all 54 of Africa's countries. Now, today I am joined by Ms. Kerry Leitcher in South Africa, who was the main editor of the recent report, Threats to African Borders, which is the theme for today's webinar. Now, the Threats to African Borders report that we published last month was rather different to what we usually focus on. And that's mostly because we were trying to raise awareness of a number of key trends affecting Africa, as well as the world, that relate back to some of the risks that we focus on, and that can easily be resolved from a multilateral perspective. So the point of our report was to raise more awareness and to try and resolve a key trends across the continent, such as the trafficking of weapons or people, terrorism and insurgency, and illegal immigration flows into Europe and other countries. Now, for today's presentation, I would like to start off by tying in some of these trends that we specify in the Threats to Africa's Borders report to some of the work that we do at EXX Africa on a more frequent basis. This essentially relates to the fact that fragile borders across Africa drive much of the political instability and insecurity risks, as well as economic risks across the continent. This we have recently seen in a number of countries in Africa, where, for example, fragile borders in the Horn of Africa have driven increasingly flows of refugees or internally displaced people across the Horn and elsewhere in Africa. We have seen similarly a flow of illegal weapons from outside of the continent entering into the Horn. And this really has driven up some of the crime risks, political instability, and broader insecurity in the Horn of Africa, just to give one example. And my colleague Kerry will focus on this momentarily in a bit more detail. But very often it is the fact that borders in Africa are porous and fragile, rarely monitored appropriately, is that what's driving political instability and insecurity, as well as economic risk. And this really ties in some of the key problems in terms of the perception of risk in Africa. Almost whoever you ask these days, there is a common consensus regarding what risk in Africa means. And very often people will still focus on Africa-specific perils, such as war and mutinies, or tropical diseases, or crime in various places. But more and more people are focusing on broader themes that are posing risk to commercial operations. This involves a lack of infrastructure, or debt issues, or an inability to service debt, and particularly also a recent rise or an ascendancy of populist politics across the continent, which has also fostered a sentiment of nationalism, whereby both physical borders as well as symbolic borders like tariffs, for example, are increasingly being raised at a time when most of the continent is actually focused on trying to bring down these types of barriers to trade through the implementation of the Africa Free Trade Agreement. Now, what we try to do at EXX Africa is even though the perception of risk very much determines its measurement, we do try to create a more granular methodology towards risk forecasting. And we have recently revised our risk forecasting methodology to bring it into line with international best practices, such as those encouraged by the UN Security Risk Management Process, as well as the European Interagency Security Forum and the World Economic Forum. And our risk methodology combines both a qualitative and quantitative approach to assessing risk, and very much underpins all the work that we do at EXX. If you are familiar or existing members of our Insight portal, you will have noticed that we process quarterly updates of our risk score maps. This version here is the latest update to our risk score methodology and risk score quantification. And a number of key changes have come through over the past update that relates back to this idea of threats to Africa's borders. For example, in our previous risk scoring quarterly update, we had marked Rwanda in a low blue categorization. And this was very much focused on the political stability of the country, its improvements in trade practices and investor incentivization. However, over the past few months, Rwanda has engaged in a number of bilateral disputes with Uganda, with DRC and some other neighbors, in which they have closed the borders for several weeks and months in some cases. This has led us to downgrade Rwanda's risk outlook for the next year to the moderate or green coded risk outlook. This is a particular case where threats to Africa's borders are directly relating to a change in the quantification of political risk. Now, I've now just mentioned one particular case where indeed a commercial cost might be quantified where a risk is posed to threats, where a threat to borders has actually emerged as an actual commercial risk. And there's a number of key trends that we can monitor here. And I'm going to run through three particular categorizations here, where political and security risks actually affect supply chains on a regular basis. First of all, throughout Africa, we are increasingly seeing border closures or delays. This picture here, appearing on your screen, actually is the Rwandan border with Uganda that I mentioned earlier. It is in case of poor bilateral relations that Rwanda and Uganda decided to close their borders in February this year. And those borders have only been opened very sporadically for a few days over the course of 2019, despite a number of bilateral agreements to try and resolve that dispute. Similarly, South Africa and Mozambique closed their borders at the beginning of this year and threatened to close those borders again during an outbreak of anti-immigrant violence last month. Ethiopia and Eritrea have had their borders closed for many years until July 2018. And in fact, a few months ago, Eritrea did close those borders again. More recently, Chad and South Sudan and Sudan have also closed their borders because of insecurity across those frontiers. Morocco and Algeria have had closed borders for the past 25 years. Similarly, changes in government, may they be constitutional or not, also very often close Africa's borders, as it did in Nigeria's elections in February this year or Congolese elections at the end of last year. During the attempted coup in Gabon at the beginning of this year, Gabon's borders were closed for several hours, and Sudan's borders were also closed in the beginning of April during the military intervention in that country. And as I mentioned earlier, very often those borders are still closed, particularly with Chad and a number of other neighbors because of fears of insecurity. One may actually also add that disease also is a key factor in the closure of borders. We have seen this in outbreaks of tropical disease in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where borders were closed on the Copper Belt frontier with Zambia, causing huge delays, usually of several days, impacting copper and cobalt and gold and tin exports to Durban. And more recently, we have seen the border closures because of the Ebola outbreak in the Great Lakes region, where borders between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo have been shut. And now there's even concern that the borders with Tanzania might be closed because of a suspected outbreak of Ebola, according to the World Health Organization and US authorities in that country too. Another way in which threats to borders actually can be quantified as a commercial risk is through the targeting of state assets. Now, Kerry will talk about this more in a moment. However, we have seen a number of security-related incidents this year already in which non-state actors frequently target key state infrastructure assets during acts of militancy, labor unrest, or sabotage. We can see this particularly in the Sahel region, in countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, or Niger, as well as in the Maghreb and North Africa, most prominently, of course, in the ongoing civil war in Libya, as well as in the Horn of Africa in places such as Somalia and Somaliland. But not just in these very restive and unstable countries do these types of state assets targeting take place. Because of the importance of logistical infrastructure assets, labor unions or activist groups also frequently target these type of state assets, such as airports or major commercial highways in places such as South Africa or Kenya and Egypt, for example. And we have seen this recently in South Africa during outbreaks of service delivery protests and political protests, which frequently spill over onto highways and airport access routes. And then the third way in which threats to borders pose a commercial risk is to private assets, where private assets rather than state assets are targeted. Now, we can talk extensively about examples such as piracy, although this is usually very much localized in places such as the Gulf of Guinea, or to a lesser extent, the Gulf of Aden on the east side of the continent. More prominently throughout Africa, it is the cost of corruption to private assets and private business concerns, particularly in the logistics sectors, of course, which is particularly vulnerable to corruption, given the various engagements that the logistics sector has, vulnerability to customs officials who are often underpaid and look to increase their wages through opportunistic facilitation payments. The African Development Bank says that the average customs transaction across the continent can involve 30 to 40 different parties. In case of a corrupt transaction, we can usually add anything between 10 to 50% of the value of the transaction as some sort of, let's call it, facilitation fee or payment. Therefore, graft increases commercial operating costs across inter-regional and international trade in Africa. This is particularly important as we are indeed trying to bring down the barriers to trade and open up Africa's continent to free trade, whereby the cost of corruption might still remain quite prevalent. And similarly, the corruption at ports of entry and exit also is very much focused, is also exposed to illicit activities such as tax evasion or smuggling of various people and goods across these points of entry and exit. Most of Africa's imports come by sea, in fact, the vast majority. So therefore, corruption at ports of entry and exit are a very prevalent risk when we're looking at the cost of business for private assets. So I've been talking about the commercial risk that might be posed by these threats to African borders. but I think it's important to actually try and establish what are the actual primary threats to Africa's borders. So for me, this is a good point to hand over to Kerry Leitcher, who will run through a number of the key primary threats to Africa's borders, starting with the driver of illegal immigration across Africa. Secondly, also the trend of transnational criminal networks. And thirdly, the phenomenon of militant and terrorist groups across Africa's borders. So, Kerry, could you please tell our audience how illegal immigration, what patterns exist across Africa?
Thanks, Robert, and thanks to everyone for dialing in. I hope you can hear me clearly. So for the first threat to African borders, what we're going to discuss is the threat of illegal immigration. Now, a good starting point would be to look at a definition of illegal immigration, given it's a bit of a contentious issue at the moment. What we'll do is we'll stick to the definition provided by the International Organization for Migration. Now, according to the IOM, the term illegal immigration is reserved specifically for cases concerning human smuggling and human trafficking. Now, human smuggling involves the procurement of services by an individual or a group for that person to gain access to a country where they are not a resident or they don't have citizenship. Human trafficking, on the other hand, is not a voluntary transaction. It typically involves some sort of human rights abuse, there's coercion involved, etc. So for the first section of our presentation, we're going to look at human smuggling under illegal migration, as it tends to involve a whole lot of actors. It can involve transnational criminal networks, which we talk about in the second part, but it involves other actors as well, so it deserves its own focus. Robert, if you can switch to the next slide, we can have a look at the 5 major routes of illegal immigration in Africa. Now, according to the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, there are 5 major routes of human smuggling in Africa. These are the 2 northern routes from the Horn of Africa and the west of Africa up northwards. There's the eastward route from the Horn of Africa to the Arabian Peninsula, and there's 2 southern routes from the Horn of Africa to southern Africa, and then from central and southern Africa into South Africa. We're going to briefly touch on each one of those 5 routes. We're going to look at the trends. We're going to look at which ones are the most popular, how much it costs to go along those routes, and we're going to discuss some mitigation measures as well. Robert, you can take us to the next slide. So the first 2 routes that I'd like to begin with are the 2 routes starting in the Horn of Africa. Now, the first route, which is shown with the map on the left-hand side of the screen, starts in countries such as Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. The route is conducted primarily over land. Individuals here travel mainly through Sudan, where the town of Matema is strategically important. Here you can procure the services of the majority of smugglers, particularly Bedouin communities, who will then take you northwards into Egypt and Libya, and ultimately onto your final destination, which typically is Italy, or it was a couple of years ago, and wider Europe. Now, the popularity of this route on the left has decreased somewhat in recent years. In about 2015, we had about 50,000 illegal immigrants moving along this route or procuring the services of smugglers along this route, and this has dropped to around 30 to 20,000 illegal immigrants in recent years. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First and foremost, this route on the left is actually very expensive. So in order for you to move from your home destination of Eritrea, Ethiopia, or Somalia onwards all the way to Europe, it's going to cost you anywhere between $5,000 and $8,000. Now, illegal immigrants are typically people who are seeking better economic opportunities abroad, or they are seeking some sort of international protection, either as an asylum seeker or as a refugee. So $5,000 to $8,000 is a really high price to pay to procure the services of smugglers. A second reason why this route has sort of decreased in popularity in recent years has to do with various mitigation measures that have been implemented in North Africa. So a couple of years ago, Egypt, as a result of numerous smuggling networks moving through its country, decided to implement a specific type of legislation heavily penalizing anyone involved in smuggling. Here you could face fines of between 30 and 50,000 Egyptian pounds, and you could face heavy imprisonment sentences as well. Coupled with the implementation of numerous security measures, human smuggling through Egypt virtually stopped in around 2017. Of course, then we saw the flow of human migrants moving through Libya, and we're all familiar with the images that came out of that, people crossing the Mediterranean and embarking on the route from Libya, and the various atrocities that were associated with that. However, over the past 12 to 18 months, 2 years really, we know that Europe has actually stepped in to intervene, particularly Italy. Italy has gone to great lengths to boost the capabilities of the Libyan Coast Guard, and has worked with various actors in Libya to prevent people from leaving its shores. Now, those measures have obviously come under heavy criticism, as it is argued that it led to the sort of enabling of various armed groups in Libya. But nevertheless, we've seen a decline in illegal migrants moving through Libya over the last couple of years, and actually we've seen a shift westwards in North Africa, which I'll talk about in a minute. Let's then move on to the second route here, which is the East African route from the Horn of Africa to the Arabian Peninsula, as demonstrated in the map on the right-hand side of the screen. Here, your immigrants typically depart from Eritrea, Djibouti, and Bosaso, and the towns of Obak and Bosaso are strategic towns, just like Matema in Sudan. The route is primarily conducted over the sea, as illegal immigrants will procure the services of smugglers to get to Yemen, with the ultimate destination being Sudan. Now, this route has remained relatively popular in recent years and has arguably increased in popularity. 2016, we saw around 100,000 illegal immigrants moving from the Horn of Africa into Yemen and into the Gulf. But most interestingly, we've also seen a reverse flow of migrants from the Gulf into the Horn, where we had around 80,000 migrants moving in the opposite direction. And this largely has to do with the fact that Yemen has been in a state of conflict for a number of years now. Now, this route has remained relatively popular, particularly when compared to the northern route from East Africa, for two reasons as well. Firstly, it is quite cheap to procure the services of smugglers along this route, where you can move from the Horn of Africa to your end destination in Saudi Arabia for less than $1,000. This, compared to $5,000 to $8,000, explains the difference in popularity. Secondly, mitigation measures along this route haven't been as successful. We know that various policies implemented by Ethiopia and Puntland to prevent their citizens from working in Saudi Arabia didn't work. Similarly, deportation policies within Saudi Arabia haven't deterred migrants either. And the key reason here is that Yemen remains the ultimate weak link in the chain. Yemen is a key transit point along the route, and Yemen doesn't have the capabilities to man its borders and prevent people moving through its country onwards to Saudi Arabia. With the state of conflict continuing, it is likely that this route is going to remain popular for quite some time. Right, Robert, we can move to the next slide, which is
thank you.
In Africa.
Thank you, Kerry. Yes, and you've already mentioned some of the most important routes, which, of course, shows people moving northwards. But there are a number of routes as well, less significant, certainly, but still definitely worth mentioning. And that's the southward route. Now, the first point of origination is in the Horn of Africa, which I've already described, a hotbed of instability, particularly in places like Somalia and parts of Ethiopia. Here, people move usually through Kenya, through the large refugee camps in Kenya, then on the way through the Rift Valley to Tanzania, Zambia, and then usually through Zimbabwe, where the small groups decide to go to Botswana, other small groups decide to cross over into Mozambique. But the vast majority of illegal immigrants then decide to use the Bait Bridge, Zimbabwe to South Africa border crossing, which will then usually take them to Johannesburg. And from there, immigrants may then disperse further inside the country. The second point of origination is in the Great Lakes region, particularly Democratic Republic of Congo. as well as to a lesser extent places like Burundi and the Republic of Congo. Here, a similar route through Zambia, Zimbabwe, or sometimes Botswana is used to access the hub for immigration in Johannesburg. To a lesser extent, also, there is a flow of refugees or immigrants from Lesotho. This depends, of course, on times when there is a conflagration of insecurity or political instability in the small mountain kingdom. Interestingly, of course, is that South Africa has a struggling economy at the moment, already very high unemployment, and anti-immigrant rhetoric has certainly been stepped up over the past few years, and that triggers inevitably outbreaks of xenophobic or anti-immigrant violence in key urban centers, as we saw again last month. I think before we wrap up this section, I think I'm going to hand over back to Kerry to describe one more route, perhaps the most prominent route that still needs to be discussed. Back to you, Kerry.
Thanks, Robert. So the final route that we're going to discuss is from West Africa through the Sahel upwards to North Africa. So just like the route from the Horn of Africa into North Africa into Europe, immigrants typically start their journey along the coastal states in countries such as Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, all the way down to Sierra Leone and Liberia. They then move mainly through Mali and Niger in the Sahel, where the town of Agadez is a key strategic point, just like Matema was in the Horn of Africa. From there, you can then procure the services of various nomadic tribes who will take you onwards to Algeria, previously Libya and Morocco, and increasing now upwards into Europe, specifically through Spain. Now, the popularity of this route has remained very consistently high over the last couple of years, where it is estimated that around 300,000 people move along this route every year. In 2016, it was estimated that 100 illegal immigrants were crossing Mali's borders every single day, just to give you an idea of the numbers there. And there's a couple of reasons for this as well. Firstly, this route is also quite cheap in comparison to the Horn of Africa route through North Africa. Along this route, in order for you to move from your origin state in a coastal city in West Africa to Europe, it's going to cost you around $1,000 again. So there's a big price difference there. And secondly, mitigation measures have not been as successful here, although they are likely to increase in the coming years. We already discussed that Egypt and Libya were able to stem the flow in their countries, and this has shifted the flow of immigrants now into Algeria and Morocco. Algeria and Morocco are now stepping up their efforts to combat illegal immigration. We know that Algeria has spent around $20 million in the past 2 years, particularly implementing measures around security and deportation, which unfortunately has come under heavy criticism for. We know that Algeria and Morocco are now similarly reaching out to Europe for assistance in this regard. And we wait to see how that will affect across that region as well. Having covered the West African route now via the Sahel in North Africa, that then brings us to the end of our illegal immigration section for this presentation. And Robert, we can move to the next slide.
I was going to mention, Kerry, that in this particular case, it's very difficult to establish any real parallels between illegal immigration and country risk. You can certainly say that the origination or departure points from many illegal immigrants is certainly due to insecurity. However, if you look at the combined political risk map on the left-hand side of your screen, it's very often people do also, departure points are not always political risk hotbeds either. They're very much only focused on insecurity. To prove my point, some of the fastest growing economies in Africa forecast for this year are, in fact, some of the largest exporters of illegal immigrants, including Ethiopia and Djibouti, South Sudan, Niger, and Mauritania. And conversely, some of the slowest growing economies in Africa, including some of its largest, are actually the intended destinations for many illegal immigrants, including South Africa and Nigeria to some extent as well. These large economies are barely registering growth at all for 2019. And similarly, there is also no real parallel in terms of countries that are receiving a lot of investment. Certainly South Africa is receiving a lot more investment in 2019 than previously. A number of other countries which are hotbeds of insecurity and which are triggering illegal immigration flows, such as Ethiopia and Democratic Republic of Congo, they are also receiving a lot of investment. So it's difficult to see a parallel between foreign direct investment and economic growth to the trends that we're seeing. At this point, I'd like to start discussing the transnational criminal networks, and I'm going to hand over to Kerry again to describe this pattern.
Thanks, Robert. If we move to the next slide, we get a good idea of the types of transnational crimes that take place across Africa. Now, it's important to note that all of these crimes are sort of prolific in every single region. Some regions are hotbeds for one type of crime over the other. So, for example, maritime piracy is more prominent in the Gulf of Guinea. However, we do also find it off the Horn of Africa and in some instances in Southern Africa as well. We know financial crimes take place across the entire continent too. Small arms and light weapons trafficking is also prolific across the continent as well. But for the purposes of our presentation, we're just going to zone into a couple of these crimes to give you an idea of where they're taking place across the continent, how prolific they are, and ultimately what the impact is to the region and to commercial entities operating there as well. Robert, we can hop over to the next slide. So the first type of transnational crime that I would like to talk about is small arms and light weapons trafficking. Now, the first slide that I have up here relates to small arms and light weapons trafficking in North Africa. And I know that the majority of the people dialing in here today you're going to be aware of this. Following the fall of the Gaddafi regime in 2011, we had a proliferation of small arms and light weapons into the wider North Africa region and into the Sahel. Indeed, in some instances, up to the Middle East as well. It's estimated that anywhere between 250 and 700,000 small arms and light weapons flooded the region, and we are very much still feeling the consequences of this today. These small arms landed in the hands of a number of criminal organizations, so significantly upping the risk when engaging with these various organizations and really increasing their capabilities as well. Something we hadn't necessarily been seeing so much before, and of course, enabled the formation of a number of militant groups in the region as well, which I'll talk about in my third presentation. As a result of this, transnational crime is very much linked to militancy in the region. Everyone talks about the crime-terrorism nexus as well, and the proliferation of small arms certainly enables this. In fact, it is an enabling crime in the region. Let's move on to the next slide and talk about a different type of small arms and light weapons trafficking that might not be as known to everyone dialed in today. And this is the trafficking of small arms and light weapons to the Horn of Africa and to the rest of the continent, indeed across the Sahel and also southwards into Central Africa. So the first source of small arms and light weapons trafficking here is from Yemen. We all know that Yemen has been in a state of conflict for a number of years, and Houthi rebels are funded and equipped by Iran. What we also know is that Houthi rebels sell off these weapons in order to raise funds for their war efforts. And in many of those instances, those weapons make its way across the Gulf of Aden into the Horn of Africa, specifically into countries such as Eritrea and Djibouti. And we have been able to trace those small arms moving southwards into conflict zones such as Somalia. The second type of small arms and light weapons trafficking that I'd like to talk about is from China. Now, following media reports of such trafficking last year, we decided to launch our own investigations and found that a high number of small arms and light weapons are moving through the port of Djibouti from China. Now, China has a strategic military base in the country, and China has been looking to procure a number of military deals with various governments across the continent. In particular, we know that they have entered into various deals with Sudan, for example. Now, while these arms move from China to the Horn of Africa in a legitimate fashion, and these agreements with these various governments are legitimate as well, what we have been able to trace is that these small arms and light weapons, more often than not, given the fact that these states are in a period of instability and there's a lot of criminality in a number of these states, end up in the hands of a number of non-state actors and rebel groups. So, for example, we were able to find through investigations these small arms and light weapons in Sudan ending up in the Darfur region, which obviously is under an arms embargo. And given the porousness of the borders in the region and the interconnectedness of non-state actors in the Sahel, we've been able to trace these arms moving from Sudan to Chad, to Niger, and to Mali as well. If we move on to the next slide, we can begin to get an idea of the consequences of all of this. And one of the consequences that probably hits home for the majority of the people dialed in today relates to an increase in violent crime as a result of a proliferation of small arms and light weapons in a particular region. Now, earlier this year, we investigated this and looked at the connection the connection between the proliferation of arms and violent crime. And we were able to trace an increase in violent crime in a number of East African states, and particularly East African commercial hubs. So, for example, our number one state in the region with high levels of violent crime is, of course, Kenya, where we looked at Mombasa and Nairobi. And between 2014 and 2018, for example, there was a 63% increase in recorded incidents of crime, and particularly violent crime, where we see a lot of criminal actors using small arms in their attacks. We've also seen an increase in express kidnapping, specifically targeting foreign nationals in the city. Another country in East Africa that has been impacted as a result of small arms and light weapons trafficking in the region is Tanzania, where we've seen increases in violent crime in cities such as Dar es Salaam, Arusha, and Zanzibar. If we move on to our next slide, we're going to hop across the continent and we're going to look at another type of transnational crime. Then for this slide, we're going to look at cocaine trafficking in West Africa. Now, cocaine trafficking in West Africa has increased over the last decade to decade and a half, following an increase in security measures along the Caribbean route. Cocaine trafficking in West Africa obviously involves transnational criminal groups having connections to primarily gangs in South America, where Brazil has been a major source country. Cocaine moves through West Africa, through the Sahel and North Africa, obviously porous borders there, to end destinations primarily in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. However, we have also been able to see that there has been an increase in cocaine consumption in West Africa as well, given the high numbers of the substance moving through the region. It is interesting to note that there are three possible routes for cocaine traffic in West Africa, and these are labeled on the map on the screen. The first route is you can go by the eastern hub, which is through Mauritania and Mali. The second route is through the northern hub, which is probably the most famous for people, as it involves Guinea-Bissau, which was infamously called Africa's first narco state a couple of years ago. And then we have the southern route, where you can go through the more sort of familiar countries of Nigeria, Benin, Togo, or Ghana. Now, while the route through Guinea-Bissau has remained very popular over recent years, what we have also been able to trace is an increase in cocaine trafficking through the southern route, particularly through our major economy of Nigeria. Barbara, we can move on to the next slide. This then brings us to our third threat to African borders, and that is the topic of militants and terrorist groups. Robert, if you take us to the next slide, I'll be able to kick us off there. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about here is actually looking at conflict incidents in Africa versus the rest of the world. Now, conflict across the world no longer necessarily involves states. Interstate conflict is, of course, happening, but increasingly so, we see the involvement of non-state actors This is certainly the case in Africa. We have governments dealing with non-state actors in their locations, and non-state actors combating themselves as well. And these non-state actors are contributing to an increase in conflict in Africa, so much so that in many years, the number of conflict incidents in Africa versus the rest of the world is almost half. If we move on to the next slide, these non-state actors are more often than not involved in some level of militancy or terrorism. And if we look across the continent, the graph demonstrated there shows the area that I would like to talk about today, and that is the frequency and impact of militancy and terrorism in the Sahel. Over the last couple of years, particularly from 2014, the number of terrorism-related deaths in Africa has been concentrated in the Sahel. And it's a pity that this graph ends in 2017, because we would have seen a major uptick in the Sahel in 2018 and 2019. Now, what does this mean for professionals working in the region? Well, as Robert reflected on in the earlier part of this presentation, according to the Emerging Markets Logistics Index, terrorism is the #1 concern cited by professionals operating in North Africa and the Sahel. And there's good reason for this. We have a number of incidents targeting state and private infrastructure. Terrorism-related incidents obviously primarily target state security forces or local groups, but increasingly so we are seeing attacks against seaports, airports, mines, hotels. That's something I'm going to talk about in a second as well. So this is definitely a concern that needs to be driven home for any commercial operator in the region. Now, terrorism in the Sahel is a major concern. According to the US State Department report from last year, in which they were reflecting on terrorism around the world, the US noted that while various measures have been implemented to try and contain the threat of militancy in the region, these measures have ultimately failed. And if we look at the 3 most significant attacks that took place across the world last year, this point is driven home. The 3 largest attacks last year occurred in Africa. They occurred in Somalia, which largely sits a little bit outside of the Sahel, but the 2nd and 3rd largest attack occurred in Central Africa, the Central African Republic, which sits in the Sahel. So we're really talking about high impact attacks. So severe is the situation that the Sahel has been labeled the #1 militancy hotspot to watch, according to the Institute for Peace in 2019 and going forward. And this largely has to do with an increase in attention the region is receiving from global terrorist groups as well. So since 2016, for example, over 60% of Al-Qaeda related attacks took place in Africa, specifically the Sahel, where we typically associate the group with operating in the Middle East. Secondly, while we talk about a decrease or the elimination of Islamic State across the world, in fact, the membership numbers of Islamic State have not dropped off at all. There's around 20,000 members of Islamic State, and a lot of those are actually sitting in Africa through its various affiliates. Robert, if you take me to the next slide, I will be able to look at who's actually orchestrating these attacks. So up on the screen, we have a map of attacks in West Africa and the Sahel. And I just want to talk through the primary threat actors here. Essentially, there are 2 groupings operating across the Sahel. The first one operates mainly across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And here we have 2 types of actors operating. We have an Islamic State affiliated actor known as Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. And the second one is an amalgamation of Al-Qaeda affiliated groups under JNIM. Moving a little bit westward, we have the second hub of militant activity. This is around Nigeria, particularly the Lake Chad Basin. Here we have Boko Haram, which everyone is familiar with, but we also have an offshoot of Boko Haram operating here known as Islamic State in the West Africa province. Now, across both of these regions, we have Islamic State and Al-Qaeda affiliated actors orchestrating attacks, meaning that they are competing for primacy. And the result of porous borders, poor mitigation measures, and allegiances with various local communities, we have seen a dramatic increase in attacks over the last couple of years. So, for example, in our first hub around Mali in 2016, we were able to record around 80 violent incidents attributed to these groups. But as of last year, we had around 465 incidents carried out by these groups. This is obviously not just a dramatic increase in the numbers, but we saw an increase in geographic expansion. Previously, these attacks were largely confined to Mali, but increasingly so, we are seeing these attacks taking place in Burkina Faso and Niger. Rob, if you take us to the next slide, we get a better idea of the implications of this for the wider region. So just like in East Africa, where we released a report on the effect of arms trafficking to East African coastal states, we decided to look at the effect of militancy in the Sahel on West African coastal states in a separate report. And what we were able to find is, as a result of the southern expansion of militancy in the region, a number of West African coastal states are now at a risk of terrorism. Specifically, we were able to label Côte d'Ivoire, Benin, Togo, Senegal, and Ghana being at particular risk. Now, there's a couple of reasons why these countries are at particular risk, and one of them has to do with them either being former French colonies or having high French expats living in those territories. And what we know about the militant groups operating in the region is that they have a high anti-French and anti-Western sentiment. In fact, they have come out and called for attacks against French enterprises and institutes. And this largely has to do with a very high French security presence in the region. I think it's also important to elaborate on the capabilities of these groups. So as a result of their geographic expansion and access to a high number of weapons in the region, we've been able to see them carry out very complex coordinated attacks. And this was demonstrated last year in a complex attack in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. Here, militants affiliated with JNIM, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliated group, and staged an attack not only against the military base, but against the French Institute and the French Embassy as well. So really bringing home that anti-French sentiment within the coastal states and the Sahel. Rob, you can take us to the next slide.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kerry. And I wanted to, before we wrap up, also mention a number of key hotspots for militancy and terrorism on the other side of the continent, in the Horn and East Africa. Now, obviously, Sudan and South Sudan have had a number of insurgencies and forms of militancy in their respective countries and with each other over the past generation. But at the moment, the highest number of internally displaced people across the world actually originates from within Ethiopia. And that's because of the increase in sectarian, ethnic violence that we have seen pop up in that country over the past few years. Similarly, the Al-Shabaab insurgency in Somalia and cross-border into places like Kenya certainly also remains a key form of terrorism and militancy that needs to be watched. This is highlighted by Al-Shabaab's rather ambitious twin attack on US Special Forces base and a convoy of Italian peacekeepers in and near Mogadishu just a few days ago. Similarly, in the Great Lakes region, we are still seeing a particularly prevalent form of militancy around the borders of the DRC with Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi, as well as in parts of those particular countries. This is all happening at the same time as the Ebola virus outbreak in very much the same area, as well as the closure of borders for bilateral disputes between Rwanda and Uganda, as well for the containment reasons for the virus between Rwanda and the DRC, and possibly now also Tanzania. So this is an area where militancy is overlapping with bilateral disputes, as well as one of the most virulent strains of the Ebola outbreak that Africa has seen in recent history. I think one more particular type of insurgency to point out is the one in northern Mozambique, a part of the country where billions of dollars of investment will be injected over the next few years by companies such as Total or ExxonMobil. And this is happening at the same time as a rather persistent form of insurgency, potentially inspired by Islamist ideology and potentially garnering some support from intra-regional militant groups, is also affecting this region. Now, if you wish to know more about any of the materials I just mentioned, then certainly you are very welcome to contact us to ask for a copy of the Threats to African Borders report. Similarly, if you are not already subscribed to our member platform, then almost every topic that Kerry and I have mentioned today is also available on there in its analysis format. If you are not already a member, you are very welcome to contact us to ask for a complimentary trial, to access some of the stories regarding the Sahel that Kerry mentioned, or the recent attacks in Somalia, or indeed the containment measures in the Great Lakes region. However, for now, I would like to prompt you to ask any questions. And as you will see on your screen here, if you are attending us live rather than during the recorded version of this webinar, then please, if you have a question, then click the button on the left-hand side of your screen, type in your question, and we will pick it up. I am delighted to say that we do already have a particular question. Kerry, this is a question regarding anti-French sentiment in relation to Ghana. What are your comments, building on what you said earlier here, just to specify that point?
Yes, I'd like to say thanks for that question. So there's a strong anti-French and anti-Western sentiment coming out of these groups. Obviously, anti-state sentiment as well, given the fact that a good portion of attacks take place against security forces. Now, the various countries that I mentioned were former French colonies, such as Côte d'Ivoire, such as Senegal, such as Benin. But in relation to Ghana, of course, it's not a French colony, but the intent to target Ghana comes from the fact that Ghana participates in a number of regional counter-security, terrorism, counter-insurgency measures against these groups. In particular, they participate in the UN mission within Mali. So there you're going to drive intent from Islamic State in the Greater Sahara and the JNIM group. So it's really seen as a threat coming as a result of retaliatory attacks. So the fact that these regional groups are targeting these militant groups will in turn target states involved in that. You saw that happen a couple of years ago in the Middle East. Any state that was involved in the coalition against Islamic State, for example, was in turn a potential target for attack. And Islamic State used to come out and release a whole number of countries that they wanted to stage attacks against. So given the fact that Ghana participates in these efforts in the region, leaves it vulnerable for attack.
Kerry, thank you very much for that explanation on that key point you mentioned there regarding anti-French sentiment in relation to Ghana. There is one more question which potentially can also go to you, Kerry, and this is in relation to that big cocaine seizure in Equatorial Guinea. To what extent do you at EXX Africa believe that this was indeed intended for the Sahel? And what do you think is the impact of this type of financing? Is there potential for more acquisitions of hardware, weapons, etc. in the Sahel insurgency? Could you specify a little bit more in terms of the cocaine trade and insurgency in West Africa, in the Sahel?
So I think the first thing to mention is, and just repeat, is the very close linkages between these transnational groups, criminal networks, and militancy in the region. Now, to a large extent, yes, the cocaine moving through West Africa is destined to go through the Sahel and ultimately to Europe. But as I mentioned, we are seeing higher consumption rates locally, specifically along those West African coastal states. So there's good reason to believe that some of that cocaine was destined to be consumed locally as well. You see the same thing happening in South Africa, for example. We have cocaine trafficking through the region here too, and while it is destined for other regions, we are having higher consumption rates at home. Now, given the crime-terrorism nexus and sort of the involvement of a whole number of groups, I mean, transnational criminal groups have to pay taxes and extortion fees to militancy, we see the smuggling of cocaine through the area really upping the ante in that regard as well, giving them access to illicit funds, increasing the propensity for violence in these transactions as well. Yeah, so I think it contributes to the risk overall. Robert, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Thank you, Kerry. No, I think you addressed most of the key points there. I'm keen to remain within our 1 hour time frame for this webinar. I would like to thank all of our live attendees today. I'd also like to mention that a recording of this webinar will be sent to you within the next few minutes. Otherwise, if you would like to contact us with any further questions, you can contact us at insight@exxafrica.com or through our website contact section. And otherwise, Kerry and I would like to thank you all for your attendance today. And for those of you on the recording, also like to wish you thank you very much for your interest. And we hope to do more of these webinars over the next few months. That's us signing out from EXX Africa. Thank you very much for your attention today.